The film begins with a well-dressed man awakening from his sleep, disturbed by a fly tickling his cheek. He appears to have a throbbing headache. As he regains his senses, his gaze falls upon a dead rat lying beside him, with flies swarming around it. The man is startled, realizing that he is trapped within a vault-like room, with an iron door visible in the enclosure. The surroundings are repugnant, filled with buzzing flies, and the light reveals a significant number of dead insects. Initially, the man considers the possibility of being pranked, suspecting his colleague, Fletcher, as the instigator. He contemplates reprimanding his assistant once he manages to escape from the room. Glancing at his watch, he notes that it is 9:32 in the morning. However, he soon realizes the absence of any activity beyond the door. Attempting to make a phone call, he discovers no signal reception. Despite walking around in search of a signal, his efforts prove futile. He also inspects the room for hidden cameras but finds none. Frustration begins to mount, exacerbated by his urgent need to urinate. He retreats to a corner, mockingly relieving himself. Unbeknownst to him, this act will have consequences later on. He then resorts to knocking on the iron door, but receives no response from the outside. Consumed by mounting frustration, he removes his belt and employs the buckle to create louder noises against the door. Enraged, he directs his anger towards the locker within the room, verbally abusing it. He even climbs atop the locker to gain a vantage point and assess his surroundings. Subsequently, we witness a transition to the following day. The scene within the room has further deteriorated, with maggots feasting on the deceased rat. As the man wakes up, his phone slips from his grasp. He attempts to check for a signal, but once again, his phone proves useless, much like everything else in the room. At this moment, he becomes acutely aware of his extreme thirst. Recalling the corner where he urinated the previous day, he resorts to collecting and consuming some of the urine in his shoe. The solitude of the room begins to take a toll on his mental state, as he exhibits peculiar behavior, including physically slapping the overhead fluorescent light. In doing so, he notices the presence of a key. Determined, he manages to bring down the light fixture and retrieves the key. Convinced that it may unlock the locker, he approaches it with caution, apprehensive of encountering something frightful or dangerous. However, he musters the courage to open it, discovering 2 gas canisters and a blowtorch inside. Additionally, goggles, a hammer, and a chisel are also present among the items within the locker. The man proceeds to set up the equipment, revealing his lack of familiarity with these tools. Attempting to open the iron door, he strikes it with the hammer and chisel, only to discover that it resists his efforts. In a hopeful yet futile attempt, he ignites the blowtorch and brings it closer to the sprinkler system, hoping for water. Disappointed once again, he starts playing around with the blowtorch, experimenting with its capabilities. He then directs his attention to the large door, using the blowtorch on it, hoping to find a weakness. However, the door remains immovable, without even a dent. Frustration takes hold, leading him to shout, verbally abuse, and physically assault the room and its contents. Resorting to kicking the door proves equally fruitless, as it remains firmly in place. Exhausted, the man sits against the wall, succumbing to a state of seeming madness as he engages in self-conversation. In the midst of his ramblings, he notices a small mark on the wall, almost like a hole. Seizing the hammer and chisel, he begins striking that specific spot. Unfortunately, a chip flies into his eye, prompting him to curse, yet he persists. Eventually, a dent forms in the wall, signifying progress. Drained and famished, the man contemplates his limited options for sustenance. Rejecting the idea of consuming the rat, he opts for the maggots instead. Reluctantly, he consumes one, followed by a handful, nearly causing him to vomit, but he manages to retain his composure. Returning to the wall, he resumes digging, enlarging the hole to the point where he can glimpse steel bars. Utilizing the welding gun, he cuts through the bars, allowing a ray of light to filter into the room, reinvigorating him. He persists with his excavation, creating a hole large enough for him to pass through. To his horror, upon emerging from the hole, he realizes he has landed in a vault identical to the one he was initially trapped in. A sense of despair overtakes him as he realizes his efforts have been in vain. He vents his frustration by shouting and pounding on the iron door. Exhausted from his futile attempts, the man finally gathers himself and decides to explore the second vault. Inside, he discovers a lamp and a coffin, which unnerves him. Summoning his courage, he opens the coffin, only to be shocked by the sight of a sleeping girl inside. Startled, the girl awakens and begins screaming, fearing for her life. Desperate to escape, she squeezes through the hole the man had previously dug. Despite his efforts to explain the situation, she refuses to listen or believe him. Resigned to her skepticism, the man approaches her, extinguishes the light, and settles down to sleep in the very coffin she had occupied. Now, on day 3, the man is found sleeping in the woman's coffin while the girl enters through the hole and attempts to remove the dead rat from the floor. She wakes the man and suggests that they work on the wall. Although the man appears too exhausted to continue, as using the hammer and chisel requires considerable effort, the girl decides to assist him. She takes hold of the chisel, but as the man prepares to strike the first blow, she quickly withdraws her hands to avoid injury. It turns out that the girl is afraid of hurting her hand. To overcome this, they switch roles. The man takes the chisel while the girl holds the hammer. However, her strikes resemble more of a tap than a blow, leaving minimal impact on the wall. Amused, the man laughs while pointing at the meager mark they've made. He then moves aside, allowing the girl to continue with the hammer and chisel. Unfortunately, she ends up injuring herself in the process, and she also needs to relieve herself. Choosing to maintain privacy, she climbs into the other vault. The man follows, but the girl perceives him as a threat and grabs a sharp object to defend herself. It is at this point that he explains the necessity of recycling. He clarifies his plan for her to urinate in his shoe so they can later drink it to prevent dehydration. Initially reluctant, the woman refuses to urinate in his shoes. However, the man attempts to convince her by highlighting the potential consequences, such as his death and her remaining alone with limited means to escape. After a heartfelt speech, the woman becomes slightly persuaded and asks the man to turn around. Following her request, she urinates into the shoe and hands it to him. The man begins drinking from it, leaving some for the woman, who reluctantly consumes it due to the lack of alternatives. Now, their focus shifts to finding sustenance. The idea of consuming maggots crosses their minds, and the man eats one in front of the girl, who is nearly overcome with disgust. Returning to the girl's vault, the man resumes digging the hole while the woman expresses her emotions, believing she may be facing consequences for her past actions, an experience they both seem to share. To distract her from these thoughts, the man starts singing, eventually coaxing a smile from the woman. He continues singing while chiseling, lifting her spirits. However, considering his current condition, he cannot sustain this for long, prompting him to stop. It is then the girl's turn to sing, showcasing her pleasant voice as she harmonizes with the rhythm of his hammer and chisel. The situation continues with the two of them enjoying their time until the man accidentally strikes his finger with the hammer, causing it to bleed. Swiftly, the girl tears a piece of cloth from her head tie and wraps it around his injured finger. However, the man persists in his efforts. He holds the chisel and instructs the woman to strike it with the hammer. As she does, the lock on the iron door, situated opposite them, begins to turn. They rush towards the door, but the lock rotates back to its original position. After multiple attempts, they finally realize why the locker reverts to its original place. The man discovers that the locker will only rotate and unlock the door when they have their backs facing it. Slowly, they walk backward towards the door, and upon reaching it, they find another room beyond. This room is the third one they have encountered, but it contains different items. They spot an empty grave with a tombstone and another iron door. The woman retrieves the necessary tools from her vault, and they attempt the same method to open the iron door, but it proves ineffective this time. Feeling helpless, their only option is to dig in the grave, hoping to create a new tunnel. However, the man's condition deteriorates significantly. He tries to dig but collapses, ultimately giving up. The woman tries to console and encourage him. Eventually, the man realizes what their captor desires. He wants them to kill each other, which explains the presence of the grave. He momentarily points the chisel at the woman but ultimately refrains from harming her, venting his frustration through screams. Overwhelmed, he throws himself into the grave and begins crying. The man is now so weakened that he can barely lift his own arm. The woman attempts to motivate him, resorting to kicking and slapping, but the man remains unresponsive. Eventually, she manages to bring him to the edge of the grave and gently lays him down. Desperate for a response, she shouts at the iron door but ends up succumbing to tears. At this moment, a new idea occurs to her. What if she nourishes the man with her tears? Gradually, the man regains enough strength to brush his hand against the girl's chest, causing her heart to race. They realize that these could be their final hours together. In a bid to keep him alive, the woman becomes intimate with him. Despite their exhaustion, they find solace in each other's presence. The girl undresses, and the man, still capable of more than just crawling, is awakened from his near-death state by her tender care. In the midst of the vault, they make love, sharing a moment of connection. Afterward, they drift into a peaceful sleep. When the man wakes up, he finds the girl curled up beside him. He rises and goes to the other vault, tearing a piece of velvet lining from the coffin. Using it as a makeshift shawl, he covers the woman, ensuring her warmth and comfort. Weakened by days of starvation, the man's condition worsens, and he begins to lose consciousness once again. In his dazed state, he hears the sound of the lock rotating. Energized by the sound, he wakes the girl, and they remember their previous experience. They position themselves with their backs to the iron door, drawing closer to it. The man, who has been laboring tirelessly without proper sustenance, is so feeble that he can no longer walk unaided. The girl supports him as he stumbles toward the iron door. Finally, it swings open. To their relief, they discover that it is not another vault but a breathtaking sight unfolding before them. The world beyond the iron door appears as beautiful as heaven, with waterfalls, birds, and flowers adorning the landscape. Overwhelmed with joy, they exchange smiles and embark on their journey towards this magnificent outside world.